what I talked about earlier today is that I wanted for you to understand that Christianity and libertarianism are not opposing doctrines, but in fact, libertarianism, in its true form of liberty, of believing in liberty, is the Christian political statement. Christ does bring liberty to the nations. He does bring liberty to everybody. He does bring political liberty as well. And so my two talks were, the first talk was on convincing secular libertarians that there is no way for you to be a libertarian unless you're a Christian. If you're a secular libertarian, your secularism makes you less than a libertarian. You have to be a Christian in order to be a true libertarian. Okay. And this talk will be to the other group that I want to address, and I hope there is not a single one of you today that is the target of my talk. But if there is, I'm going to talk to those Christians who don't believe in liberty, who believe in statism. Okay? And my point is this: you can't be a true Christian unless you're a libertarian, unless you believe in liberty. Did you hear that? Pretty tough statement, but you can't be a Christian if you don't believe in liberty. Recently, the president of a large and influential Christian college met with a group of Christian students at the Institute for Religion and Democracy to talk about what he considers a rising threat on the American political horizon. His talk was titled Libertarianism, Calvinism. Did you hear that? Libertarianism, Calvinism, and Young Evangelicals. He started with finding Calvinism very dangerous. Not just Calvinism, but Calvinism which carries with itself the political doctrine of libertarianism. Okay? No wonder those Calvinists are pretty dangerous. They were always the first to pull the trigger in the fight for liberty. Okay? They were the first to fire the opening shots of any revolution against tyranny. Historically, the only libertarians that have actually done something against tyranny were Calvinists. It's a fact. It's a historical fact. You don't see any successful revolution in history against tyranny for liberty that was not Calvinist. Every revolution that was not Calvinist replaced one form of totalitarianism with another form of totalitarianism. The only revolutions that actually replaced tyranny with liberty were started and finished by Calvinists. So he knows it, so he claims that Calvinists are very dangerous. In the lecture, he found libertarianism dangerous too. And since there are three elements in the title, Young Evangelicals being the last one, I think he considers Young Evangelicals dangerous as well. Okay. Well, I'm a Christian, I'm libertarian, and as you can see, I'm relatively young. Don't say anything. He must be speaking of me. He spoke about the challenges posed by libertarian influence beliefs, increasingly popular among young, reformed people. I'm quoting from him, from his lecture actually. I'm not sure what challenges he's talking about, to be honest with you. I've never seen a young reformed libertarian challenged by his libertarian beliefs. And I'm pretty comfortable with my libertarian beliefs. Libertarianism is actually exactly in line with the doctrines of the Reformation. And in fact, as R.J. Rushton explained so many times, libertarianism is exactly in line with the doctrines of Scripture. A challenge for that Christian professor apparently was the fact that the young Reformed libertarians want the government out of certain areas. He's not comfortable with the fact that we want the government out of certain areas. He mentioned a few of those areas, and the four big areas he talks about are marriage, abortion, drugs, or prostitution. He thinks this is dangerous. He thinks the government should be involved in these areas and regulate them or control behavior by legislation in these areas. Now, he's not honest, because the first thing I want to say is I would like to know who that Reformed believer is that wants the government out of the area of abortion. In fact, we do believe the government should be involved here, okay? I believe that the civil government must punish abortion with what the biblical penalty for murder is. What is the biblical penalty for murder? Capital punishment, death, okay? That's the law in the books in Texas, by the way. Did you hear that? Texas? That's the law on the books in Texas. That's a law that our state doesn't enforce, or we have bought into the erroneous idea that the Supreme Court ruling of 1973 in Roe v. Wade is a law that our state must obey. Actually, we have forgotten that Roe v. Wade is not the true name of that lawsuit. What's the true name of that lawsuit? It is the Supreme Court versus the state of Texas, where Texas defended the value of life. The weight there is Justice Wade of, I think it's a Dallas, from Dallas area. It was a state justice. Texas defended the value of life, and the Supreme Court defended the culture of death. I don't believe the federal government or any federal institution should tell Texas what to do with murderers. I believe Texas should defy the ruling, restore the enforcement of the law against abortions, and tell the Supreme Court to come enforce their own ruling. And make sure they pack enough heat. Concerning marriage, drugs, and prostitution, the issue is quite different. Now here I want to know, where does the Bible say that the government should involve in these issues? That professor claims to be a Christian, and before he talks about any issue, he should be able to give biblical verses. He did not quote the Bible in defense of his ideas, by the way. His only defense for government interference in these areas, marriage, drugs, and prostitution, was, listen to this, that there is no way to fully privatize those issues and that the government cannot remain neutral. Notice his argument. If an issue is a public issue, it is by default a civil government issue. Did you hear that? That's a very important point to consider. If an issue is a public issue, it is by default a civil government issue. That's what he is saying. And for the government to not remain neutral, it must regulate. He doesn't allow for the possibility that there is public outside the government. And he doesn't allow... Actually, let me go back a little bit. He does say, actually, if the government privatizes marriage, that would mean that marriage has no public purpose. This is a direct quote from his lecture. If the government privatizes marriage, that means if the government backs off and says, okay, let's leave it to the churches, let's leave it to the private institutions, that would mean that marriage has no public purpose. That means that whatever public purpose your marriage has must be controlled and regulated by the government. That's what he's saying. He doesn't allow for the possibility that the government may be restrained from a certain action and still have an opinion on something. He doesn't believe in limited government. He believes in a totalitarian government which acts in all situations, no matter what. Otherwise, he claims it will remain morally neutral. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe drugs and prostitution are sins. Don't get me wrong about this, okay? And I believe that God will eventually punish people who do those things. I do believe, as the Bible says, and as the law in Texas goes, even if not enforced, that the government has the right to involve when the family covenant is breached. Did you know that we have that law on the books in Texas? And we're not enforcing it? And the injured party demands restitution. If somebody breaks the family covenant and the innocent party demands restitution, the government should be there to make sure the restitution is paid. Okay? But also, as far as the law of God goes, I see a differentiation in the Bible between what is sin, that is what is an offense against God, which God will himself punish, and what is civil crime, which is an offense punishable by an act of the civil government. For example, prostitution is sin. No doubt about it. But in itself, the law of God provides no civil penalties against it. Alright. You want me to stop here and let this sink, or? Okay. Unless, of course, there is a specific violation of the family covenant where we need a specific complaint from the innocent spouse to create a civil case. There is no civil penalties in the law of God against prostitution. Drugs may be a sin or maybe not. Some use drugs to distort reality and destroy the image of God in themselves, which is obviously sin. Others use drugs to overcome pain, which is legitimate in God's eyes. Either way, there is no civil sanction against either of these in the law of God. Okay? There is no permit to use drugs, and there is no civil ban against using drugs in the law of God. In the family, like I said, adultery can become a civil issue only when there is a complaint by the innocent spouse. The law of God apparently provides for forgiveness within the family. Do you hear that? The government may involve only if there is a complaint. Meanwhile, the spouse has the option to forgive before he takes the other spouse to the civil government, to the court. The famous law about stoning a rebellious son, which many today, even Christian preachers, have misinterpreted to mean a young boy when it actually means an adult son, because it describes him as a drunkard. It's talking about an adult son living with his parents. Even that law still requires the active complaint of the parents. A government agent cannot knock on your door, get in your house and say, "Your son is a drunkard, let's take him out there and stone him." Are these public issues? Yeah. But does the Bible require that the civil government involve and regulate them? No. Why? Because there's much more to society and social order than government interference in regulation. Let me tell you this, my children's disobedience is a public issue. And your children's disobedience is a public issue. Okay? If your children or my children grow up disobedient, we will have a problem as a society. But does that mean there should be a government agency to visit your home and spank your kids when they need it? Their education is a public issue too. We will see a lot of dead government agents, you know, in Texas if they visit homes to spank children. A high level of attrition. Their education is a public issue too. But again, I don't need a government agency to educate my kids. Thank you very, very much. What we put on the table to eat is a public issue. What I build in my backyard is a public issue. What books I buy and read to my kids is a public issue. What I'm preaching and teaching to y'all today is a public issue. What we believe about science and God and ethics and many other things is a public issue. What kinds of cars we drive is a public issue. But do we want the government to tell us what to do in all these areas? And does the Bible empower the civil government to intervene in all these areas? No. But the president of that Christian college I mentioned before wants to get the civil government involved in these issues. For these issues, he says, are public. And whatever is public must be regulated by the civil government. Of course, in a godly Christian way. You know, these socialists, they want the government to control everything, but not with Christians in power. And not with Republicans in power, which is even worse sin. and not with Christianity as the official religion. We want the same thing as them. We want the government to control everything except that Christians and Republicans should be in power. Imagine a top-down government with a cross on the top. Imagine Moses, who doesn't lead his people out of Egypt, but topples the Pharaoh's regime and establishes another regime, just as centralized and totalitarian. Except, of course, that the temples along the Potomac River, the Nile River, are dedicated to Yahweh. All in the name of fighting secularism and socialism. That's what he wants. We actually had an example of such attempt in the history of Europe in the last 1 century. We all know about the socialist experiments under Nazism and communism. Few in America realized that there was a different sort of fascist experiment in Europe, which was Christian-based and right-wing. Do you know that? There was actually a fascist country that was Christian-based and right-wing and conservative in Europe. Few Americans know about General Francisco Franco and his fascist regime in Spain. Even fewer know that his ideology came from the Falanga, a political, ideological organization of well-meaning conservative Christian lawyers and professors in Spain who wanted a conservative Christian corporate state along the lines of Mussolini's Italy, but still committed to the Catholic Church and to the Christian faith, to fight socialism, communism, and the decay of morals. Yes, we had such an attempt. Franco took their ideology and created one of the most oppressive regimes in Europe at the time, destroying in the process not only communists and socialists, which he did well, but not so well, but also destroyed all regional autonomy, all private initiative, all political initiative, and all individual liberty. He was a good psychologist, and he played on the religious feelings of the Spanish people, declaring his oppressive regime to be simply a protector of good morals, of the church, of the traditional family. I actually recently, after we started this One Liberty Tours, recently read one of his speeches. You wouldn't believe how many times Franco refers back to good morals and the traditional family. In the end, the regime controlled how many hours a woman can work outside home, what clothes men and women should wear, whether a woman can drive a car or not, what the parents could teach their children, etc., etc., etc. Franco took Primo de Rivera's, this is the founder of the Falanga, dream of a collective, integral national faith, a direct quote from Primo de Rivera's book, and applied it to practice, or rather imposed it in practice by force. At the end, when Franco died, his regime was so universally hated that what he claimed to protect, good morals in the church, went into such steep decline that church membership and attendance dropped by 90% within several years after his death. By 90%. A traditionally Roman Catholic country went down, church attendance went down so steeply as it has never done before in history in any other place. And social morality crashed completely. In fact, if you look at Spain today, it has the highest rate of drug addiction in Europe. And immorality is rampant in Spain. And what he claimed to oppose, socialism and communism, took over Spain without a fight. The result of Franco's fascism was that Spain at the end was as close to socialism and immorality, and as far away from righteousness and justice as she's never been before, probably since the times of the Carthaginian influence on dominance on Spain. In the ideology for that fascism in traditional Christian churchian garb was provided by a few well-meaning conservative Christian pro-church, pro-traditional family academics and lawyers. Fascism in Spain was not the occult, atheistic type of fascism in Italy or Germany. It was conservative and it was right-wing. And it carried the cross and swore in the name of Jesus Christ. A more thorough study in the history of Franco's regime and its failed policies to contain socialism, communism, and the decay of morals would be necessary for today's America. Why? Because we today have our own Phalangists in America. We in America have our own well-meaning lawyers and academics who are concerned about the growth of socialism, about the decay of morals, and want to deal with it in a centralized, tyrannical, fascist way. They have the same ideology as the Spanish Falanga, a centralized corporate state imposing a collective national integral faith and accepted morality upon the population. Of course, for good purposes. Just like the Phalangists in Spain in the 1920s and the 1930s, our American Phalangists actually speak against liberty, speak against state rights. One way to know them is if they value the 14th Amendment over the 10th Amendment. This is a good way to recognize who is an American Phalangist today. If you hear him speaking about the 14th Amendment as over against the 10th Amendment, you know this guy is a Phalangist. Okay? They speak against libertarianism. Just like the Phalangists of the 1930s in Spain, they want a central government to intervene and impose morality in everything. They don't believe in states' rights. They don't believe in county rights. They claim it is the federal government that must intervene in issues of morality over the responsibility of the individual and the laws of the local governments. And just like the Phalangists in Spain, they will eventually bring about our own Francisco Franco in America, and will eventually destroy the Christian roots and character of this nation, using Christianity as an excuse for fascism. I know you're thinking, no, it's impossible in America. You bet they were thinking the same in Spain in the 1930s. They will if they are not exposed and stopped. Some of these academics and lawyers are leaders of successful Christian ministries and have influence in Christian circles, just like the professor I mentioned a little bit earlier. But Christian Europe and Christian America in the past give us a better example to follow. And the better example to follow is the division of powers. And not the division of powers proclaimed by that French anti-Christian guy, Montesquieu, but the division of powers that was known long before Montesquieu and was operating in Europe for centuries. It was the division of powers established by Moses, not Montesquieu, and by the law of God. And it was a real division between institutions in the society, family, church, and civil government. We today understand division of powers as division between legislative and executive and judicial. But the Christian division of powers is between family, church, and civil government. In addition to this, in Europe at the time, there were local provincial governments. For example, in France, they called them parliaments. Okay? Trade and economic alliances, like the Hanseatic League. Anybody who knows the history of Northern Europe knows about the Hanseatic League. It was an economic organization that had the power of a local government. There were communities like cities and cantons. Martin mentioned Switzerland earlier today. And what is the division, the legislative division in Switzerland? The cantons. And they had their own laws and customs. There were universities. There were student fraternities that had their own laws. Can you imagine that? Students at the time were so mature that they could actually make their own laws, and those laws were at the level of county laws or city laws and so on. In fact, students' fraternities at the time were properly called nations. If you go to medieval Europe and you say anything about a nation, people will think, aha, you're talking about a student fraternity. That was a nation at the time. Okay. guilds, religious orders, clans, charitable institutions, chartered ports, and settlements for maintenance of mountain passes, etc., etc., etc. Ever looked at the map of Europe and seen all these little bitty nations like Monaco, and Andorra, San Marino, Liechtenstein? Ever looked at those and wondered, how did these come into being? Well, these were independent legislative communities, and they were charged by the kings to maintain mountain passes, or with specific, or maybe they were a chartered port like Monaco, and the king said, you can have your own laws as long as you maintain the mountain pass or you maintain the port and so on. And this is where it all came from. Okay? They all enjoyed what today would be called legislative immunity from other institutions, including royal authority. They owed allegiance to the church and to the civil authorities, but they were not controlled by the church and by the king. In fact, they jealously guarded their liberties against both church and state. With all these competing powers in the society, there was only one single unifying principle: the law of God as declared by the church, later in the Protestant Reformation as declared by scriptures. All life was religious, and therefore it was one religious law that governed all of life, but not one human institution. The first parliaments established in Christian Europe did not have legislative functions, actually. Imagine Congress that can't make laws. That's going to be a paradise on earth. As a matter of fact, at the time, no institution had legislative functions, period. Not even the church. Did you hear that? In Christian Europe, no institution had legislative functions. Why? The law was not the prerogative of human institutions. It was whose law? God's law. Human laws were only attempts at interpreting God's law for the specific context and situation of the institution. The church interpreted the law for the whole society. Every other institution interpreted it for its specific area and mode of operation. Executive powers also were shared horizontally, not vertically. Horizontally between church, state, guilds, local communities, families, and individuals. And in this setting, the parliaments emerged as a judiciary power to offset the growing power of kings. Parliaments actually had only consultative functions at royal courts. They could annul king's decrees. Did you hear that? They could annul king's decrees. Long before there were constitutions, the parliaments acted as constitutional courts, curbing the excesses of the executive power. Parliamentary representatives were supposed to act as judges, determining whether the king's edicts were in accordance with custom and with the law of God. The most influential parliament of Europe, the Parliament of Paris, for example, had the duty and the privilege to record the king's edicts. And the same parliament had the healthy republican habit of refusing to register those of the king's edicts the parliament disagreed with. In fact, in France, at the time, there was only one way for the king to overrule a parliament's refusal to register an edict. It's called in French, lit de justice, which means the bed of justice. And in that ceremony where the king could overrule a decision by the parliament was to appear before the public in his bed, in his pajamas. Only in that very humiliating position could he sign an overruling of the parliament's decision. You bet not many kings took advantage of it. For all practical purposes, the Parliament of Paris acted as a supreme court for the French kingdom. It was a judiciary, not a legislature. In England, the Parliament was an even mightier force in curbing the king's absolute power. Let's not forget, in the 17th century, who acted as court of justice against King Charles? The Parliament. And for what? For his refusal to abide by the decisions of whom? Of that same Parliament. In this way, way, the original idea of parliaments was to maintain a republican form of control over a monarchical form of government. Res publica, republic, was properly understood not as a form of government, but as a restraint on government. That's a very important thing for us to understand today. We have a very wrong view of republic. We think republic is a form of government. And that's even among those of us that should know better. A republic was a public thing, a society where no one has the absolute power to control the society, not even the king. So republic was not a form of government. It is a restraint on government. Did you hear that? John Adams, of all people, defined the British form of government as a republic. John Adams, in one of his letters. Because it was not a government of one man, because the king himself had to comply with the limits imposed on him by the parliament. Republic was a negative notion, negative in the sense of restraint on something. It was not a form of government. Any form of government could be a republic at the time. Monarchy could be a republic, aristocracy could be a republic, oligarchy, democracy, as long as power was not in the hands of one man or one institution only. And in addition to Parliament, there were multiple other agencies and institutions which had their own privileges and their limited areas of jurisdiction and control and curbed each other's successes when necessary. Let me give you an example. An individual was protected from tyranny because he could appeal to so many institutions, including the church and including his own family, for protection. Louis XIV, the absolute king, the Sun King, had problems assembling his armies because in France the solution to join the army was entirely in the hands of whom? In the father. In the hands of the father of the family. The father had to allow his son to join the army. Remember the Three Musketeers? Anybody read the Three Musketeers by Dumas? Okay. What was the one thing that a young man had to have with himself when he would approach a military commander to join his unit? There's only one thing that was required. What was it? A letter from his father. And if the father said no, the young man couldn't join the military. And you know what? Everything was public. But public meant that everything was regulated by one law, the law of God. Unlike our modern perceptions today, public did not mean regulated by the civil government. The civil government had a very limited sphere, along with the church, with the family, and the individual, who also had their limited spheres. And even the civil government itself was not centralized. Different civil governments, different levels, had different rights, different responsibilities. We think that our division of federal, state, county today is very decentralized. Study France in the 17th century to see what decentralized means. And when you're done studying it, your conclusion will be that the United States of today is a thoroughly totalitarian state. But our Christian college president wouldn't have any of that. We don't need a Moses who leads his people out of Egypt, DC. We need a Moses who becomes a Pharaoh and makes Egypt, DC obey God. The problem with this, of course, is that unless you leave Egypt, you're not going to Sinai. And you're certainly not going to the Promised Land. This is a very common problem we have today in the church. We have Christians who reject the notion of liberty or libertarianism because they do not see solutions to the problems of the day except through federal laws, Supreme Court rulings, and constitutional amendments. We have Christians who are little statists, little Egyptians, believers in reforming the centralized system of Satan, in replacing the overall kingdom of God with just another kingdom of man. Except that this one will be much better. It will be modified by prayer events, religious rhetoric, and Bible reading. We have Christians who just want a king. And indeed, some of them say, isn't the law of God speaking against all kinds of evil and sin? If that is so, what is the problem with making the federal government impose laws that limit sin? I mean, we want to limit sin in the society, right? Why don't we take the federal... It's just a simple solution. Come on. Let's take the federal government and impose laws on this family, on the school, in the university, the marketplace. If you want the law of God applied, why shouldn't we make the civil government apply all of these laws? The answer to this is, well, how about having a government agency spanking your kids? Why limit it to these areas? Why not go to the bitter end of it? It's a biblical command to spank your kids. Do you want the civil government involved in it? No. We know that the law of God is called the perfect law of liberty. Christians who are against libertarianism claim that this applies only to the spiritual inner being of man, but not to his society. We cannot have liberty in the society. We cannot have liberty of the individual, they claim. We have to get the government involved in everything we do to make sure that our whole society obeys God. The problem is, this is not biblical. The perfect law of liberty applies both to our spiritual condition and to our social order. Okay? The redemption of Jesus Christ does provide for the freedom of human spirit, as the Westminster Confession states. And I'm not going to go through it's a long quote, but it's a very good quote. You got to go to the Westminster Confession to see the liberty which Christ has purchased for believers under the gospel consists in their freedom from the guilt of sin, condemning wrath of God, the curse of the moral law, and so on and so on. It's a wonderful statement of the liberty we have in our inner being. But does that liberty translate into our society? Are we to be free in the spirit and ruled by pharaohs, even if they are Christian pharaohs? Or are we to have a free society that reflects that spiritual liberty that we have in our hearts? Is God only the liberator of our spirits, or is He a liberator of our societies as well? And if He liberates our society, and if His law is a perfect law of liberty, how does it express itself in the society? The expression is in a legal principle that most Christians not familiar with the law of God fail to understand. And I'm going to go into some legalese here, but then I'm going to explain myself. For those that are lawyers, if there are any lawyers, because they can't understand plain language, okay? The prescriptions of the law cannot be separated from the institutional framework that the law requires. This is for the lawyers. Now, for us normal, intelligent people, the law, I'm just kidding. The law is concerned about what the society does, but it is also concerned about who and what institution imposes the specific sanctions of the law. Did you hear that? It's not just what the law requires, but also who is empowered to enforce it. In short, what does the law say to whom? Everything that the law says must be put in a specific institutional context. What institution is charged with enforcing what law? Children need to be spanked, but what institution is charged with the privilege and joy to do it? I'm just kidding. Adulterers must be executed, but who is authorized to start a covenantal lawsuit against an adulterer? A rich man cannot withhold grain from the market with the goal of raising its price, but is there an earthly institution that is charged with taking it away from him, or is it God who personally gets involved? We must help the poor, but what is the institutional framework in which that help is really godly and therefore helpful and effective? We have to answer all these questions. Christian liberty in the heart must translate in the society. And since Christian liberty in the heart starts with the rule of Christ, Christian liberty in the society must start with the rule of Christ. And the rule of Christ means that no human institution even the one that is fully legitimate and led by Christians, can have total power in the society. No human institution can have the total power in the society. The ideal of the Republic, that is a society where no man but Christ has all authority, is the Christian ideal. Augustine's words to this effect are, and you all know about who Augustine is. He says, the only true republic is the one whose founder and ruler is Jesus Christ. As was said here before, we need to go to the law of God in order to have true liberty in the society. We will make a serious mistake if we allow ourselves to look at the law of God in an only cursory and general way, ignoring its specific applications, and especially the institutional provisions. The law of God is libertarian, not because it doesn't limit any kind of behavior, but because it establishes a healthy, godly, proper balance between the different institutions and between the individuals and the institutions. We will make a serious mistake if we assume that the moral rules of the law of God must be enforced by a centralized government in Washington, D.C. Yes, we may find a few things in the law of God which are defined as civil crimes, but we will find also quite a few things that are defined as sins, but never defined as civil crimes, which means that other institutions but the civil government are empowered to impose sanctions. It is possible that some sanctions in our society must be imposed by God Himself, and we have to have the faith and the trust in God that He will deal with them better than any human institution. For example, building temples to foreign gods was forbidden in Israel. But faith in foreign gods wasn't. Did you hear that? The law allowed foreigners, and foreigner in Israel meant somebody who believes in foreign gods, not somebody who is of a different genetic stock. The law allowed foreigners to live and work and prosper within the borders of Israel. As long as they refrained from public preaching, they were safe from civil punishment. If you keep your faith within the confines of your home, you're safe from civil punishment. Foreign nations were not attacked simply for their faith. In fact, David and Solomon made a covenant with the king of Tyre, the same king of Tyre that was later denounced by the prophets for his religion. Conquering other nations was left to prophets, missionaries, and merchants, not the United States Armed Forces. Did you all know that Jewish merchants before Christ reached as far as New Mexico, leaving the Ten Commandments as a testimony of their presence? If the Jews were faithful to the covenant, they would have conquered the world through commerce. The family was just as important as the other institutions, and it was free of their interference in its specific area of jurisdiction. The law of God actually gave liberty to all these institutions and only defined a very limited number of sins as civil crimes. Man was free and protected. In our age of totalitarian states, therefore, a Christian social order will mean a separation of state and society. Contrary to those Christians who want to employ Pharaoh in the service of God, we need to destroy both Pharaoh's regime and his temples before a Christian order can be built. And you know what temples I'm talking about and what river I'm talking about. And therefore, we need to build, and only in this way we can build true liberty. In reality, Christians should not look to sodomy or abortion or any other sin as the big enemy of Christendom, but at the government that is taken away our liberty and that is enforcing these crimes and sins and perversions as policies. As Christians, we must be libertarians, and we must fight the tyrannical state as the greatest enemy of God, and never succumb to the temptation of using the state for furthering the kingdom of God. Martin mentioned Revelation earlier today. Let me give you just a little bit of Revelation, and you think about it. The dragon gave all his power to the beast. In history, our fight is against the beast. To end with the words of R.J. Rishtoni, many people have their own view of theocracy or the rule of God. In reality, theocracy is the closest thing to radical libertarianism that can be had. And I believe this must be the foundation of our political fight today. Anything else will result in more failure and more tyranny. Thank you. Thanks for not getting us late.
Said I'm free, yeah. Oh, I have been forgiven. God's love has taken off my chains and given me these wings. And I'm free, yeah. And the freedom I've been given, it's something that not even death can take.
Okay, Bojidar, you use Locke's definition of liberty, which definition implicitly endorses the philosophy of natural law, which Locke taught. However, I assume that you would reject the philosophy of natural law. Can you please clarify?
Yeah, we need to understand, this is a very good question, by the way, and we need to be very careful, and I need to be very careful when I say that, and I appreciate the question because that kind of puts me back into where I need to be in place. Now, we need to understand, Locke was schizophrenic about his view of natural law. When you read his theological writings, it seems like what he means by natural law, he means the law of God. When you read his political and social writings, it looks like he is a proponent of what today is believed to be natural law as law found somewhere in nature, and what today the Roman Catholic Church has as natural law, or what a lot of Christian theologians today mean as natural law, something that we do not receive from the Bible as revelation, but we kind of see in nature. Now, my argument against this second one is I've never seen the Holy Book of Natural Law. So until I find it, I don't know what it is. But what I was, Locke's definition actually was a definition that can serve both of them. Both of believing that God is the God of nature, and also that the natural law that we reject as a concept. So he was schizophrenic. I'm only taking his definition of what the law of liberty is, what liberty is, but not necessarily endorsing the bad part of his schizophrenic, side. But yeah, we need to be very careful. We need to make sure that we don't take Locke. Forgive me for the pun, but we don't take Locke, lock, stock, and barrel. Okay. All right. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, I think so. Many politicians and voters who label themselves Christians support both new and existing civil government regulations in areas that have no scriptural basis, such as forcing people to buy health insurance. Are these Christians sinning, first? And second, if so, shouldn't Christian pastors be saying so publicly?
I think, yeah, these Christians are sinning. Because you cannot be a Christian and go against the law of God. I'm not saying they're not saved, which is, I'm a Calvinist for crying out. I can't tell you who's saved and who's not. We got to wait till the end. There is the fifth point of the Reformed soteriology. This is the perseverance of the saints. They might change by the end of their life. Who knows? But they are sinning. I believe they are sinning, and I believe Christian pastors should speak about this. Let me put it this way. We will more and more see the difference between the true church of God speaking against the beast and and the false church of God, that harlot that is riding on the back of what? Of the beast. Okay? And in fact, in the New Testament, you see that, in Revelation also, you see that conflict between the harlot and the bride. Who's the harlot? The harlot is like the church, but she's riding on the back of the beast. And the church is the one that is fleeing from the beast, and then later on gives birth to a child, to the next generation of homeschoolers who defeat the beast. Because she doesn't have a government school in the wilderness where she is. That's obvious to me. My version of newspaper says Jesus. But you gotta understand this. It is. We have this conflict today between the harlot who speaks not against the beast because she writes on the beast, because her operating ideology is, we have no king but Obama. Or whoever is in Washington, D.C., or whoever is in the White House, or whoever is in the Republican headquarters. Okay? And we will have more and more this division between the true church. It is not so visible today, but it will become more and more visible. You want to be in the true church? Your pastor has to speak against the government every week, because there is no bigger enemy to Christian social order, and I mean social order starting from your heart all the way to Washington, D.C., than the government today, than the beast. And if your church is not speaking against it, you better find a better church.
I want to add, when we talk about a sin, we talk about a transgression of God's commands. What's the specific command here? This was a famous text used often in this country in election sermons. It's from 2 Samuel, I think it's 23rd chapter, where the God of Israel says, the Rock of Israel spake unto me, he who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. That is your command, and to put people in power that are not just, and by the way, David knew what that meant, that the justice shalt thou do, from Deuteronomy 16:20, that's what the law of God is. So he must be just, must rule in the fear of God, not men, so he's not blinded by sectarian concerns, constituencies, but he's going to judge for God. He's going to rule for God, God's way, using God's criteria. So if you're putting people into power who violate that, I can say there's obviously a connection here. That's a transgression of what David lays down as a command from God. They must be just in the fear of God. I would suggest that you don't go against God on his ballot recommendation.
Very good. This kind of goes in line. I think you answered it, but because it was asked, we'll allow you to rephrase it. Does mainstream does the mainstream Christian rejection of God's law stem from their rejection of a perceived harshness of God's just penalties given to Moses?
I think not. I think they're not thinking in terms of perceived harshness. What they're thinking of in terms of is man does not want to be free. Because freedom means responsibility. It was said so many times today that freedom means responsibility. Man wants to be under somebody else, and it better be not God, because being under God means being free and have responsibility. Now you got to understand this. Now, think about the world after the several generations after the flood. Okay. And you see all these people. I mean, the world is so big at the time, you can go basically to any place. You don't have to be under anybody's authority. You don't have to be under any king. And yet, we see roving bands of people going exactly in the land of the first tyrant, Nimrod, in Shinar, and wanting to build a tower where they will be all together, many people under the same name. People running away. And what are they afraid of? They're afraid of being scattered. Now, what do you mean being scattered? What does scattered mean? Who was scattered before them? Cain was scattered before them. Why was he scattered? Why was he cast out of God's presence? He committed murder. So instead of obeying God and being free, they wanted to be under somebody's authority. And the reason we have the mainstream Christianity today rejecting the law of God is exactly because deep in his heart, the fallen man wants to be a slave. What was the cry of the Hebrews when they came out of Egypt? What did they say? We want to go back to Egypt. Why? What did they have there? What is the specific thing they said? We have garlic and fish and onions for free. We don't want to take responsibility of our life. What do you mean? You're free. No, we want things for free, but we don't want to be free. It means responsibility.
I like the way that question talked about the just judgments of God, because that's a good way to put it. I think, in my experience, I've seen people challenge whether God's law is actually just. And that means we have to look at Hebrews 2:2, where it says that the law given by dispensation of angels, every transgression received a just recompense of reward. Old New Testament says everything under God's law, Moses' law, had a just sanction, a just recompense of reward. So if we say that looks unjust, what was going on in the Bible, we're saying God lied, and the New Testament is unworthy of our consideration either. You see, they're tied together so tightly, you can't separate them. And so we have to acknowledge that when they challenge this, they're pitting a different notion of justice against what God says is just. But I think the ultimate judge of the history will actually rule his way and not our way.
Very good. Do we have any more questions? I have some more that were written, but I think we covered it. They were early on.
What Art forget to say is $5. It is $5 a question. Whoever asks those questions, get your money out now. All right. Not very well at expressing it. That was a good one.
Okay.
Caught me off guard.
Yes.
You said that the state system, the beast, was the ultimate enemy, but is it not the prostitute that's riding on the back of the beast really the ultimate enemy? Because the beast wouldn't exist if the prostitute wasn't given the authority that God's given them over to the beast.
Yeah, the only reason I'm saying this is because if you look at history, and that's a topic of another conference, but if you look in history, both in biblical history and in Christian history after 1st century AD, it is our main historical enemy is actually the human empires. Okay. When you start look at Cain, I mean, always a man, a fallen man, when he runs away from God or cast out of God's presence, the next thing he does is he builds a human empire. He builds an empire where one man or a group of men control other people. And you see this with Cain. I mean, he was cast out of God's presence. What did he do? He went and built a city and named it after God, right? No, after his son. So a man can rule over other people. We see Nimrod, just a couple of generations after the flood, and Nimrod became a mighty man, and he was a mighty hunter, you know, and that's why so many rulers throughout the centuries like to portray themselves as mighty hunters. I mean, some of them with golf clubs, but that's a different thing. And then you have the Tower of Babel. You know, in the Tower of Babel, that is very significant that they wanted to have. They say, let us make a name for ourselves. One name for a group of people. What does that mean? That everybody just blends into his personality, into this big collective. And you continue further on, you continue with, what was the Exodus? God versus what? Versus the biggest socialist, Republican, Democrat, military, industrial complex machine of the antiquity, Egypt. It was a socialist government. Okay? And God took his people out of that socialist country to take them to the wilderness where they thought, oh, it's worse, but he basically was leading them to the promised land. And what was he building in the promised land? What society did he command them to have? He commanded them to have a society based on cities. And in fact, if they had a king, he said the king should have these limitations upon him. And the king was just a court, just a higher level appellate court, and not a military executive leader. And also when they decided to have a king like the nations around them, not according to what the law says, but like the nations around him, what did God tell Samuel? They want to have a king. Why? Because they rejected me from being a king over them. And you continue further on, and you see the same conflict between the people of God and human empires. Go to Daniel chapter 2. The vision of Daniel, the prophecy that Nebuchadnezzar had about the big statue, and then there was this stone cut not with human hands that hit the statue. What was that stone destroying? What did Jesus destroy when he came? He was a stone cut not with human hands, and his kingdom will become, a kingdom that will take the whole world. But what was he destroying? Human empires. Because every one of these levels there of this statue was human empires. At every stage you have human empires fighting against the kingdom of God. And then you see the Pharisees, when Pilate said, "This is your king," what did they say? "We have no king but Caesar." And then history after that is a continuous struggle of Christian libertarian society against human empires. At every point of history, this is the fight. The beast who has all the authority of the dragon fighting against the people of God. Fighting against the people of God who have no king, Christ. So, England in the 17th century, England was exactly the same. Who did these Puritans fight against? The king. And so on. So, I believe this is our biggest enemy. The biggest enemy is the enemy that builds temples, and they're official temples. It's not even sodomy. It's not even abortion. These are sins. These are horrific sins. But our biggest enemy is a centralized state. Go ahead, Lauren.
If you look at the 2,000 years of church history, and whenever Christianity did get the preeminence, it seemed like there was a period of time where laxity came in and we went downhill again. It seems to give validity to the view within the Reformed circle that the church needs persecution, needs hard times in order to stay sanctified and to stay strong. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I lived for 20 years. First 20 years of my life in a land where church was persecuted. And it wasn't any cleaner than what it is here. So persecution by itself does not create a pure church. Persecution by itself does not create a pure church. What creates a pure church is obedience to the law of God, whether there is persecution or not.
I think you should also consider Deuteronomy 8's warning against the possible side effect of prosperity. When God blesses you with all these things, remember lest you forget that the Lord God strengthens your fingers to get this well. And so oftentimes, it's not the persecution, it's the prosperity. And so when a nation is prospered, the nation is not being persecuted, it's very hard to prosper the persecution. Consequently, the decline in the spiritual domain corresponds to the forgetfulness of God's offer of his blessings. And of course, there's nothing that God hates more than gratitude. You read the scriptures. Weren't there 10 lepers right ahead of you, Lord? That's right. Why is there one coming back? This doesn't make sense. And of course, that's the attitude. We're like the 9 lepers when we're prosperous. We walk away. It's all right, I'm cool. No more leprosy, but only one back to Lord. And so acknowledging and remembering that God gave you these blessings is the key. I think it's not a matter of persecution or no persecution. It's a matter of how do we handle the character challenge of prosperity that God blesses you. That means that the blessing can be a curse if we take it wrong. And so that's the law of God kind of constrains. Says, remember. It's right there in the middle of Deuteronomy 8. Remember. Or you're going to turn your blessing into a curse. And your body will turn into wormwood. Go there.
By the way, one of the words for male in the Old Testament, when it specifically talks about the gathering together, so if every male of Israel should get together at the Passover, that has a different word for male there than the normal word for man. And that word comes from the word remember. So if you want to be a real man, you got to remember. You got to be an elephant. You have a long memory.
Very good. Thank you. Please give all of our speakers. you did not get a Law and Liberty book, we still have some, Chalcedon still has some, as well as these Faith and Obedience, Introduction to Biblical Law. These are small handouts. Very helpful to yeah. And so these are available at no charge on the literature table. Don't grab anything from no charge off the book table. Pay for that. That's free. Okay. So anyways, help yourself to these, as well as Bojidar mentioned, these came in. The good news is that y'all bought so many books that they found more books stuffed underneath, but y'all just started emptying the boxes, and so they found a bunch of books. So the bad news is you're going to have to go back and buy some more books of all the ones you couldn't find the first time. So the American Indian is one of them. Get this one, as Bojidar already mentioned. Also, Van Til and the Limits of Reason. This is a new book that they just published as well. This one I believe is $7. And so these are available back there. It's a good idea to take advantage of the discount. It's a very generous offer that Chalcedon offers us all in giving extreme discounts. So it's a good stewardship to go ahead and buy a lot of books. Let's just say, and don't just buy them.